a native of the city of Houston. Give it up for Dr. Mekel Harris.
Good evening, and I want to extend a special thank you to the committee and everyone involved with this special TEDx event. It is truly an honor to be able to spend the next few moments with you, as well as to be back into my home state, Texas, which I love. So I'd like to begin my talk tonight by sharing a story about a colleague of mine. She is an academician, she's a researcher, and she's a clinician within the field of psychology. Recently, she and I had the opportunity to sit down and talk about what it's like to work with first-year doctoral students in their first year of doctoral study. And if you know anything about this particular population, you can appreciate how exciting, how frightening, and how overwhelming their experience could be. So eager to learn from her, I tuned in and journeyed along as she shared some experiences related to her first day of class in a prior semester. So my colleague stated that she entered her assigned classroom, where she noted that about 15 doctoral students cautiously greeted her. She described the distinctive new student aroma that filled the room. And typically, my colleague said that she began her first day of class with student self-introductions, sometimes student monologues, depending on the student, her own introduction, review of the course syllabus, and then a discussion about any course-related logistics. But on this particular day, she decided that she wanted to deviate from her traditional first day of class song and dance routine, and instead delve into a controversial discussion related to ideologies and social norms, understanding and classification of psychological disorders, and psychological assessment. My colleague was teaching a personality assessment course, one of the first introductory courses in her program. And she was really mindful that incoming students are often fascinated with the topic of personality structure and development. So I'm sure in her mind, this was destined to be a really fruitful discussion. So my colleague asked her students to operationally define normal, and then consider how their own interpersonal experiences, coupled with the current socio-political climate, shaped their understanding of the norm. So she gave her students about 15 minutes to consider their individual and collective perspectives, and then she fired away with questions to specific students, that is. See, my colleague, a master strategist, realized early on in her academic career that this tactic afforded her an opportunity to get to know her students' names more efficiently, as well as set the tone of dialogue and andragogical or adult-centered learning in her classroom. She felt that this tactic was really useful in helping to prepare students for the realities of clinical practice as a budding psychologist, where quick yet thoughtful critical thinking is essential. So if you'll give me a few moments, I'd like to ad-lib the role of my colleague for a moment. All right, and action. All right, students, thank you for such a wonderful introduction, and I want to welcome you to Personality Assessment 101. You've had a few moments to spend some time thinking about your own perspectives, as well as work with some of your classmates and get to know a little bit about them as well. So I want to hear a little bit more from you. Susan, what are your thoughts related to cultural norms in today's society? Interesting perspective. George? I overheard you and Kelsey talking a little bit about this continuum related to psychological disorders and how we classify them. Do you mind telling us a little more about that? Wonderful. Wonderful contribution. And I also noted that someone described their own cultural background very different than what you might find in American society. I think that was you, Elizabeth. Do you mind sharing a little bit more with us? Okay, great, thank you. Do you all realize that this is only the first day of class? And we've already delved into this discussion very deeply. So I'm excited about how the semester is going to progress, aren't you? Yeah. All right, in scene. As you can see, my colleague is a little bit of a cheerleader type, so I can only imagine how the discussion progressed as she cheered her students along that first day of class. So, energized by the discussion that had transpired thus far, my colleague then turned to Larry to explore his thoughts on the topic. Now, quite disparate from his classmates, Larry, when my colleague asked him a question, simply stared blankly at her. My colleague was a little bit puzzled, namely because she had spent about an hour kind of setting the tone for this discussion. So she challenged Larry a little farther, yet he said nothing. She asked questions, and he continued to look at her in silence. More waiting, and more silence. So my colleague moved on that day and engaged other students in the classroom, yet at a very visceral level, Larry's inactivity really disturbed her. Later on, my colleague described that at a faculty meeting, she raised some initial concerns about Larry's inactivity. And in our consultation, what she really wanted from me was to help her understand how Larry could be what she described as completely disconnected and unenthused. So when we sat down together, I knew that it would be important for me to ask my colleague a few targeted questions, so I did just that. One of the questions I asked her was, what else did you observe about Larry throughout the semester, beyond his silence? Next, what concerns do you think Larry may have had related to social judgment or criticism from his peers? And finally, what contribution could Larry actually make within the field of psychology? How could his interpersonal style actually be beneficial to the field? See, I was conducting a quasi-assessment of my own, and I was curious about my colleague's ability to view Larry in a comprehensive and complex manner, as we're all complex human beings after all, versus her seemingly myopic view of him as an aloof student. I wondered how she viewed Larry. For example, did she view him as lazy? Did she view him as unenthused? Or was he an introvert? I also wondered if she saw him as an asset to the field of psychology, or merely a dissonant chord to her outwardly stimulating classroom melody. So my colleagues' answers to the questions that I raised were quite interesting. And what I realized is that, to some extent, she had really lost sight of the continuum related to normal social interactions. So I encouraged her to journey along with me to learn a little bit more about this continuum. In the 1920s, Carl Jung coined the terms extrovert and introvert, words that I'm sure you've all heard. Jung said that on one end, those identified as introverts tend to draw energy through solitary, sometimes creative pursuits. And on the other end of the continuum, those identified as extroverts draw energy through engagement or relationship with other people. Now, on the surface, we could think of this as shy and outgoing, respectively, but that would really be a gross misunderstanding of Jung's personality framework. When we think about shyness, shyness is best understood in terms of one's concerns about social criticism. So those individuals who are truly shy do so in order to avoid judgment, not seek internal connectedness or gain clarity of any kind. The extraversion continuum can best be understood in terms of how one grounds oneself. So in other words, does the person plug out, that is, connect to the outside world to be productive, or do they plug in to themselves to explore their own inner thoughts as a source of productivity? And when you think of it this way, whether one plugs out or in, it really is a win-win situation. So I want you to take a moment to close your eyes for a minute. I promise I won't do anything to you. Close your eyes for a minute and think about where you might fall along the continuum. Introvert, extrovert. Noting that you may have characteristics of both, and that's perfectly okay too. Okay, you can open up your eyes. It's important for you to realize that a lot of research has been conducted to really underscore the biological processes involved with introversion and extroversion, beginning with a German psychologist named Hans Eysenck. And what he noted is that when we look at the brains of introverts and extroverts, there really are some differences. In introverts, they tend to have larger, thicker gray matter in a region of the brain known as the prefrontal cortex. That's a part of the brain involved with abstract thinking and decision making, whereas extroverts tend to have less gray matter. Along the same lines, when researchers explore a chemical that's released in the brain when we experience something positive, known as dopamine, those are noted in greater levels among extroverts, whereas introverts tend to have a lower dopamine threshold. So essentially, introverts don't seem to need as much dopamine to experience arousal or excitement. So it's pretty interesting stuff. But I want to go back to Larry for a moment. Was his behavior in the classroom actually normal? And how did he compare to others in the classroom? Well, when we think about normal, we have to understand that it's conceptualized under a broad umbrella of behaviors with upper and lower extremes, rooted to some extent in our societal values and mores. I would argue that yes, Larry's behavior did fall within normal limits. Now, my quasi-assessment findings in talking with my colleague also suggest that Larry could actually be identified as an introvert. So, how does he compare to other people in society? Research estimates that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's population are actually introverts. Shocking. And I won't do the math for sake of time, but that's a lot of people. So many people, in fact, that we have to consider the array of social messages that they receive on a daily basis. So what does American society say? It says that the loudest voices will be heard. It says that in order to be successful, you've got to be sociable and outgoing. Slogans such as, make your presence known and the squeaky wheel gets the grease, really reinforce these extrovert-centric perspectives, making it difficult, some might argue impossible, for introverts to really stake a true claim in highly competitive and forward-facing environments. Now, you're probably wondering, what the heck is she talking about? Is she arguing for a society that's completely dedicated to addressing introverts' needs? And the answer is no. Some of the greatest thinkers and doers in our society, historically and contemporarily, are extroverts. And we need them. We absolutely need them to make the world go round. So, what am I saying? I'm saying that in order to fully appreciate the complexities of human behavior and social interactions, we must look beneath the surface. I'm saying that we must right the reflex to categorize them, those identified as introverts, as lazy, as passive, and unenthused in our extrovert-centric environments. I'm saying that we must recognize the strengths that each of us has to offer the world, despite our differing perspectives, our unique histories, and our individual differences. I'm saying that we must learn to listen to one another and learn from one another. I'm saying that we must consider how our own individual circumstances and situations may place us in places where we may in fact be them. So I did just that. And when I unpacked this female, African-American, dark-skinned shell of mine, I realize that my lingering place in society is a place where I in fact am them. So I encourage you to do just that. What would it look like to be able to embrace perspectives different than your own? What would it look like to be able to say, they're different than me, and I want to know more about that, to make me want to engage, not disconnect from that relationship. I should probably mention that the colleague that I talked about earlier in my talk was me. Yeah, me. And as I explored my own self, I realized that there were a lot of judgments, a lot of assumptions, and a lot of biases that I had towards an individual very uniquely different from me. So my final question for you tonight is, are you willing to accept the challenge to embrace perspectives different than your own?